The woman standing in the corner of the Duchess of Ashworth's drawing room was not breathing. Her hands, pale and steady, gripped the edges of a silver tea tray so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Across from her, the Duchess sat in her velvet chair like a queen on a throne, her lips curved into a smile that had nothing to do with warmth. And standing between them, his back to the woman with the tray, his posture radiating the kind of careless power that comes from never having been told no in his entire life, was the Duke of Greystone. He was looking directly at the Duchess. He was laughing at something she had said. And the woman in the corner, the one holding the tea tray, the one he had not even glanced at since entering the room, was about to do something that would either save her life or destroy what little remained of it. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you somewhere cozy, listening while you work? Or are you settling in for a story that's going to make you feel something? Either way, I'm Jane, and I tell stories. If you haven't already subscribed to Jane Tells Stories, do it now, because I'm about to take you on a journey you won't forget. And if you don't subscribe, you owe me a favor. I'll remember. Now, let's rewind. Because to understand how that woman ended up in that corner, holding her breath and gripping that tray like it was the only solid thing in her world, you need to know how it all began. Her name was Catherine Hartley, though no one had called her by her full name in nearly 3 years. To the household staff at Ashworth House, she was Miss Catherine. To the Duchess, she was simply Catherine, spoken like a command, never a greeting. And to the rest of London society, the ones who still remembered her, she was a ghost, a cautionary tale.
And that is precisely why one must never trust a man with a well-tied cravat.
The girl who had once been the cleverest woman in any ballroom and was now the servant no one looked at twice. 3 years earlier, Catherine Hartley had been something entirely different. She had been Miss Catherine Hartley of Hartley Manor, a small but respectable estate in Gloucestershire. She had been the daughter of a gentleman, educated, witty, the kind of young woman who could walk into a drawing room and within 10 minutes have half the room laughing and the other half wondering how she had done it. She had a sharp tongue, her mother used to say, but she wielded it like a surgeon's knife, precise and only ever used when necessary. She could turn a dull conversation into a sparring match and make even the cruelest rake feel like he had lost ground without quite understanding how. She had been invited to every house party, every ball, every gathering that mattered. Not because she was beautiful, though she was striking in her own way, but because she was interesting. And in a world where most young ladies were taught to be pleasant and agreeable and utterly forgettable, interesting was a rare and valuable thing. But then her father died. Suddenly, without warning. And with him went everything. The estate, it turned out, had been mortgaged far beyond its value. There were debts no one had known about, gambling debts, investment schemes that had failed spectacularly. Within 6 months of his death, Catherine and her mother had lost Hartley Manor, lost their place in society, and found themselves with nothing but the clothes they owned and a single letter of introduction from a distant cousin. The letter had been addressed to the Duchess of Ashworth, a woman known for her charity toward fallen gentlewomen. The kind of charity that came with conditions, the kind that required gratitude, obedience, and silence. Catherine's mother had taken a position as a companion to an elderly baroness in Bath. Catherine had come to London, to Ashworth House, to serve as a lady's companion to the Duchess. It was not a position she had ever imagined for herself, but it was a position, and in her situation that was more than most women had. She had been 20 years old when she arrived at Ashworth House. She was 23 now, and in those 3 years, she had learned things about survival that no finishing school had ever taught her. The Duchess of Ashworth was not a kind woman. She was beautiful, wealthy, and utterly aware of both. She was in her early 30s, widowed young, and left with a title, a fortune, and no intention of remarrying unless it suited her. She collected people, the way other women collected jewels. She liked having them around her, admiring her, serving her, knowing that she held their futures in her hands. Catherine was one of those people. A fallen gentlewoman, educated enough to be useful, desperate enough to be controlled. The Duchess liked that combination. She liked having someone who had once been her equal now serving her tea, arranging her flowers, reading to her when she was bored, and never, ever forgetting her place. Catherine had learned to be quiet. She had learned to be invisible. She had learned to stand in corners and hold trays and arrange cushions and pour tea, and do all of it with the kind of blank, pleasant expression that gave nothing away. But here is what the Duchess did not know, what no one in that house knew. Catherine Hartley had not forgotten how to think. She had not forgotten how to observe. And she had certainly not forgotten how to wait. The Duke of Greystone entered Catherine's life on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The Duchess was hosting a small gathering, nothing formal, just tea and gossip with a few select members of society. Catherine had been standing by the window, holding a plate of biscuits, watching the rain streak down the glass, and wondering if she could calculate how many raindrops would fall before someone asked her to refill the teapot. And then the door had opened, and he had walked in. He was tall. That was the first thing anyone would notice. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made a room feel smaller just by him being in it. He had dark hair, unfashionably long, and eyes that were almost black. His face was striking rather than handsome, all sharp angles and strong lines, the kind of face that looked like it had been carved rather than born. He moved like a man who had never questioned whether he had the right to be in any room he entered. Because he was the Duke of Greystone, and dukes did not question their right to anything. He was also, Catherine realized within approximately 45 seconds of watching him, one of the most dangerous men she had ever encountered. Not dangerous in the way of a rake or a gambler or a man with a violent temper. Dangerous in the way of someone who noticed things, who watched, who listened, who could look at a person and see past whatever mask they were wearing. She could tell because she had once been exactly the same way. The Duchess greeted him with the kind of warmth she reserved for people she found useful. She gestured him to the chair beside her, poured his tea herself, which was unusual because the Duchess never poured anything herself, and began one of her practiced performances of charm. Catherine stayed by the window, invisible, irrelevant, just another piece of furniture. Except that at one point, while the Duchess was telling some elaborate story about a ball she had attended, the Duke's gaze flickered across the room. Just for a second. Just long enough for his eyes to land on Catherine, standing there with her plate of biscuits and her blank expression, before moving on. It should have meant nothing. It should have been nothing. But Catherine felt something cold slide down her spine, because in that one brief glance she had seen recognition. Not of her specifically. He did not know who she was, but recognition of what she was. A woman pretending to be invisible who was actually paying very close attention. He had noticed her noticing him. And then he had dismissed her, because what threat could a companion possibly pose? That was his first mistake. The Duke visited Ashworth House 4 times over the next 2 weeks. Each time, the Duchess grew more animated, more carefully charming, more obviously setting her sights on him. She wanted him. Not in any romantic sense, Catherine suspected, but in the way she wanted everything beautiful and powerful and difficult to obtain. She wanted him in her collection. And the Duke, for his part, seemed perfectly willing to be collected. He accepted her invitations, attended her gatherings, sat in her drawing room drinking her tea and making conversation that was pleasant and utterly meaningless. But Catherine noticed things. She noticed that his eyes were never quite still, that he watched people the way a chess player watched the board, that when someone spoke, he listened not just to their words, but to the space around their words, the hesitations, the careful phrasings, the things they did not say. She noticed that he smiled often, but that the smile never quite reached his eyes. And she noticed that every time he visited, his gaze would find her at some point, just for a second, before moving on. On his fifth visit, something changed. The Duchess had left the room briefly, called away by some household matter that required her immediate attention. It was just Catherine and the Duke in the drawing room. She was standing by the mantel, arranging flowers that did not need arranging, doing her best impression of someone who had no thoughts whatsoever. He was sitting in the chair by the fire, holding a cup of tea he had not touched, looking at her. Not glancing. Looking. Catherine kept her eyes on the flowers. She could feel his attention like a physical weight. The silence stretched out, heavy and deliberate. She knew what he was doing. He was waiting to see if she would break first, if she would say something, acknowledge him, give him any indication that she was anything other than what she appeared to be. She did not break. She simply continued arranging the flowers with the kind of focused concentration that suggested flowers were the most important thing in her world. After what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 90 seconds, he spoke. His voice was deep, measured, and laced with something that might have been amusement. "Those flowers," he said, "are already perfectly arranged." Catherine's hands stilled. She did not turn around. "I find perfection requires constant maintenance, Your Grace," she said quietly. There was a pause. Then he said, "Do you?" It was not a question. It was an observation. She turned then, slowly, and looked at him directly for the first time since he had entered the Duchess's life. His expression was unreadable. His eyes, though, were sharp and focused and entirely too knowing. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly neutral. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You have not disturbed me," he said. "I am merely curious. About flowers. About you." Catherine felt her heart skip a beat, but her expression did not change. She had spent 3 years learning how to keep her face blank. She was not going to break now. "I am a companion, Your Grace," she said simply. "There is very little about me to be curious about." "I find," he said slowly, "that the most interesting people are usually the ones who claim to be uninteresting." Before she could respond, the door opened and the Duchess swept back in, all smiles and apologies. The Duke rose, greeted her with perfect courtesy, and the moment passed. But something had shifted. Something had been acknowledged. And Catherine knew, with the kind of certainty that came from experience, that the Duke of Greystone had just decided she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. That was his second mistake. Over the following weeks, the Duke's visits became more frequent. He always came to see the Duchess, always stayed for tea, always behaved with perfect propriety. But Catherine began to notice a pattern. He would ask questions, casual questions, the kind that seemed meaningless but were not. He would comment on a book left on the table and wonder aloud who in the household was reading it. He would mention a play he had seen and ask if anyone present had also attended. He would tell a story about a house party in Gloucestershire 3 years ago and observe the reactions of everyone in the room. Catherine never reacted. She stood in her corners, held her trays, poured her tea, and kept her face perfectly blank. But inside, she was counting. Every question, every comment, every calculated observation. He was hunting for something, information about someone, and she suspected that someone was connected to the Duchess. The Duchess, meanwhile, was growing bolder. She invited the Duke to private dinners. She arranged for them to be seated together at gatherings. She laughed at his remarks, touched his arm, gazed at him with an expression that was meant to suggest deep interest, bordering on infatuation. And the Duke accepted all of it, with the kind of polite distance that suggested he was playing his own game, and the Duchess had no idea what the rules were. Catherine did not know what the Duke's game was, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: the Duchess was in danger. And because Catherine's fate was tied to the Duchess's household, that meant Catherine was in danger too. It was early December when Catherine learned what the Duke was really after. She was in the Duchess's private study, organising correspondence, when she found the letter. It was not hidden exactly. It was in a drawer with other letters, all neatly filed. But this one was different. The handwriting was masculine, elegant, and the content was unmistakable. It was a love letter. Passionate, explicit, utterly damning. And it was not signed, but the seal at the bottom was distinctive enough that anyone who knew anything about aristocratic families would recognize it immediately. It belonged to the Marquis of Thornbury, a married man, a man with a reputation for being ruthlessly protective of his family name, a man who would destroy anyone who threatened his standing in society. The letter was addressed to the Duchess, and it was dated from 2 years ago. Catherine read it twice, carefully committed the key phrases to memory, and then put it back exactly where she had found it. Then she stood there in the silent study and thought very carefully about what she had just learned. The Duchess of Ashworth had been having an affair with the Marquis of Thornbury. That affair had presumably ended, or perhaps it was still ongoing. But either way, the existence of this letter was a weapon. If it were to become public, the scandal would be catastrophic. Not just for the Duchess, but for the Marquis as well. His marriage, his family, his entire social standing would be destroyed. And the Duke of Greystone, with his careful questions and his watching eyes and his deliberate visits to Ashworth House, was looking for exactly this kind of weapon. The question was, why? What did the Duke want with the Marquis of Thornbury? What game was he playing? And more importantly, what would happen to Catherine when he found what he was looking for? She did not have to wait long for answers. 3 days later, the Duke came to call at an unusual time. It was mid-morning, far too early for a social visit. The Duchess was not even dressed for receiving. Catherine was in the morning room, mending one of the Duchess's shawls, when the butler announced that His Grace the Duke of Greystone was here to see her Grace and would not be put off. The Duchess came down in a state of barely concealed panic. Her hair was not properly arranged. Her dress was suitable for breakfast, not company. She looked, for the first time since Catherine had known her, uncertain. Catherine was sent to fetch tea, but as she left the room, she heard the Duke say something in a low voice. She could not make out the words, but she heard the tone. It was not the pleasant, empty tone he usually used with the Duchess. It was cold, hard, the voice of a man who had stopped pretending. Catherine did not go to the kitchen. Instead, she moved to the small servants' corridor that ran behind the morning room. There was a spot where the wall was thin, where voices carried. It was not exactly eavesdropping if she was simply standing in a corridor that she had every right to be in. The Duke's voice came through clearly. I know about the letter, he was saying. I know what it contains, who wrote it, and what it would mean if it were to reach certain people. The Duchess's voice was sharp, frightened. I do not know what you are talking about. Yes, the Duke said calmly. You do. The Marquis of Thornbury is a man who values his reputation above all things. He would pay a great deal to ensure that letter never sees daylight. Or perhaps, more accurately, he would do a great deal, such as voting in my favour on a certain matter before the House of Lords, such as using his considerable influence to ensure that a piece of legislation I care about is passed, such as becoming, shall we say, a friend to my interests. There was a long silence. Then the Duchess said, her voice tight and furious, You are blackmailing me to blackmail him. I prefer to think of it as negotiation, the Duke said. You will give me the letter. I will use it to secure the Marquis's cooperation. And in exchange, I will ensure that your involvement in this matter remains entirely private. No one will ever know that the Duchess of Ashworth was foolish enough to keep evidence of her indiscretions. Another silence. Longer this time. And if I refuse? The Duchess asked. Then I will ensure that the letter becomes public. You will be ruined. The Marquis will be ruined. And I will find another way to get what I want. I always do. Catherine stood frozen in the corridor. Her mind was racing. This was so much worse than she had thought. The Duke was not just gathering information. He was building leverage. He was using people's secrets as weapons, manipulating them into doing what he wanted. And the Duchess, for all her cruelty and vanity, was about to be crushed between two powerful men who cared nothing for her beyond what she could give them. But here was the thing that Catherine could not stop thinking about. If the Duke could do this to the Duchess, he could do this to anyone. And if he was the kind of man who blackmailed and threatened and destroyed people to get what he wanted, then what would he do if he ever discovered that Catherine Hartley, the invisible companion standing in the corner, was not quite as powerless as she appeared? The answer, she knew, was that he would use her too, or destroy her. Whichever was more convenient, she could not let that happen. That night, Catherine made a decision. She was going to find that letter before the Duke did. She was going to take it, hide it, and then she was going to decide what to do with it. Not to protect the Duchess. The Duchess deserved whatever consequences came from her own choices, but to protect herself. Because as long as that letter existed and the Duke was hunting for it, everyone in this house was in danger, including Catherine. Finding the letter was easier than she expected. The Duchess, panicked and frightened by the Duke's threat, had moved it from the study to her private bedchamber. She had hidden it in a locked drawer in her writing desk. But Catherine had been arranging the Duchess's rooms for 3 years. She knew where every key was kept. She waited until the Duchess was at dinner with friends, until the house was quiet, and then she let herself into the bedchamber, opened the drawer, and took the letter. She did not read it again. She simply folded it carefully, slipped it inside her bodice, and left everything else exactly as it had been. Then she returned to her own small room on the servants' floor, locked the door, and sat on her narrow bed with her heart pounding and her mind racing. She had the letter. The question now was, what was she going to do with it? The answer came to her 3 days later, in the most unexpected way possible. The Duke came to call again. This time the Duchess refused to see him. She sent word that she was indisposed. The Duke, according to the butler who delivered the message, had smiled and said he would wait. He had then proceeded to the library, helped himself to a book, and settled into a chair as though he had all the time in the world. Catherine, who had been polishing silver in the dining room, heard this from one of the housemaids and felt her stomach drop. The Duke was not leaving until he got what he wanted. And when the Duchess finally sent word that the letter was missing, that it had been stolen, that she could not give him what he demanded, what would he do? She did not know, but she knew she could not hide in the dining room forever. She set down her polishing cloth, straightened her dress, and walked to the library. She did not knock. She simply opened the door and stepped inside. The Duke was sitting by the fire, reading. He looked up when she entered. His expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or interest. "Miss Catherine," he said. "I was not expecting company." "I know," Catherine said. She closed the door behind her. "But we need to talk." He set down his book slowly. "Do we?" "Yes," she said, "because I know what you are looking for, and I know where it is." The Duke went very still. It was the stillness of a predator that has just spotted prey. "Do you?" he said softly. Catherine walked forward until she was standing in front of the fire, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She looked directly at him. Not the way a servant looked at a duke, the way an equal looked at an opponent. "I have the letter," she said. "I took it from the Duchess's room 3 nights ago. And before you ask, yes, I read it. I know exactly what it contains, who wrote it, and what it is worth." The Duke stared at her. For the first time since she had met him, he looked genuinely surprised. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "How enterprising of you," he said. "Tell me, what does a lady's companion plan to do with a letter like that?" "That depends," Catherine said calmly. "On what you plan to do." "I plan," the Duke said, "to use it to secure the cooperation of the Marquis of Thornbury in a matter of significant political importance. And if you are wise, you will give it to me now and pretend this conversation never happened." "And if I am not wise?" Catherine asked. "Then I will ensure that you regret it," the Duke said. His voice was still pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "You are a companion, Miss Catherine. You have no family, no fortune, no protection. If I choose to destroy you, there is nothing and no one who will stop me." Catherine felt fear coil in her stomach. He was right. He could destroy her, easily, but she had not come this far, had not survived this long by backing down when threatened. "That is true," she said. "You could destroy me. But here is what you have not considered, Your Grace. If you destroy me, the letter disappears. I have hidden it somewhere you will never find it. And if anything happens to me, if I am dismissed, if I am harmed, if I simply vanish, then the letter will be sent directly to the Marquis's wife, not to him, to her, along with a detailed explanation of exactly who was trying to use it and why." The Duke's smile faded. He stood up, and Catherine was suddenly viscerally aware of how much larger he was than her, how much power he had, how little she had. But she did not move. "You are bluffing," he said. "Am I?" Catherine asked. "Are you willing to risk your entire plan on that assumption?" They stared at each other. The fire crackled in the silence. And then, very slowly, the Duke began to laugh. It was a low, genuine laugh, the kind that suggested he was actually amused. "Well," he said, "this is unexpected. Tell me, Miss Catherine, who are you really?" Catherine felt something twist in her chest, because that question, simple as it was the most dangerous thing he could have asked. "I am exactly who I appear to be," she said carefully, "a lady's companion." No, the Duke said. He was studying her now, really studying her, the way he had been trying to study her since the first day he walked into this house. You are not. A lady's companion does not think like this, does not act like this, does not stand in front of a duke and threaten him with such perfect composure. You are educated, you are clever, you are desperate, and you are hiding something. Catherine said nothing. The Duke tilted his head. Let me guess, he said. You were someone once. Someone with a name, a place in society. And then something happened. Your family lost their fortune, perhaps. Or there was a scandal. And now you are here, pretending to be invisible, waiting for your chance. It was so close to the truth that Catherine felt her breath catch, but she kept her expression neutral. Does it matter? She asked. You want the letter. I have it. What are we going to do about that? The Duke considered her for a long moment. Then he said, What do you want? Catherine had been waiting for that question. She had been planning for it since the moment she decided to take the letter. I want 3 things, she said. First, I want a guarantee that the Duchess will not be harmed or ruined by this. You will get your letter, and you will use it however you wish. But the Duchess's involvement will remain private. She is not a good person, but she has given me a position when I had nothing. I will not be the instrument of her destruction. The Duke nodded slowly. Agreed. And the second? Second, I want a position, Catherine said. Not here. Somewhere else. A position as a governess or a companion in a respectable household. Somewhere from London. Somewhere I can disappear and live quietly without fear of the Duchess's anger when she realizes the letter is gone. Also agreed, the Duke said. And the third? Catherine took a breath. This was the dangerous part. The part that would either save her or condemn her. Third, she said, I want to know why. Why do you need the Marquis's support? What legislation is so important that you would blackmail and threaten and destroy to achieve it? The Duke's expression hardened. That, he said coldly, is none of your concern. Then I suppose we have reached an impasse, Catherine said. Because I do not hand over weapons to men whose intentions I do not understand. You could be trying to pass a law that saves lives, or you could be trying to pass a law that ruins them. I will not be responsible for either without knowing which. The Duke stared at her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he sighed. It was a tired sound, the sound of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. There is a bill before Parliament, he said slowly. A reform bill. It would place restrictions on the use of child labour in factories. Limit the hours children can work. Require minimum safety standards. It is not a radical bill. It does not end child labour. It simply makes it slightly less likely that children will die in factories before they reach adulthood. Catherine blinked. That was not what she had expected. The Duke continued, his voice flat. The bill has been proposed 3 times in the last 5 years. Each time it has been defeated. Not because the majority of lords oppose it, but because a small group of very wealthy men who own factories have used their influence to ensure it never comes to a vote. The Marquis of Thornbury is one of those men. He does not own factories himself, but he has investments in companies that do, and he has been one of the most vocal opponents of any reform. So you are blackmailing him to support the bill, Catherine said slowly. Yes, the Duke said. I am blackmailing him. Because I have spent 5 years trying to achieve this through proper channels, and 5 years watching children die while men like the Marquis count their profits. So yes, I am willing to use blackmail. I am willing to use threats. I am willing to do whatever it takes to ensure that this bill passes, because the alternative is that more children die. And I find I cannot live with that. Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. She had expected him to be playing some game of political power, some scheme for personal gain. She had not expected this. "Why do you care?" she asked quietly. "You are a duke. You have wealth, power, everything you could want. Why does this matter to you?" The duke looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Because when I was 8 years old, my father took me to one of his factories. He wanted me to see how his fortune was made. And I saw children, younger than I was, working in conditions that would have killed a grown man. I watched a girl, she could not have been more than 6, lose her hand in a machine because she was too tired to move fast enough. And when I asked my father why we allowed this, he told me it was necessary, that this was how the world worked, that I would understand when I was older." He paused. His jaw was tight. "I am older now," he said, "and I do not understand. I will never understand. So I am using every tool at my disposal, including blackmail and manipulation and threats, to change it, even if that makes me a villain in the eyes of people like you." Catherine stood very still. She thought about the girl in the factory. She thought about the Duke as a child, watching something that should have been impossible to witness. She thought about the letter in her bodice, and what it represented, and what it could do. Then she said, "I do not think you are a villain, Your Grace." The Duke looked at her, surprised. "I think," Catherine continued, "that you are doing something terrible for a good reason, and I think that is something I can live with." She reached inside her bodice and pulled out the letter. She held it out to him. "But I have conditions," she said. "You will not tell the Duchess that I took this. You will arrange for me to have a position somewhere else, as we discussed. And you will write to me when the bill passes. Because I want to know that this mattered, that it was not just another political game." The Duke took the letter slowly. His fingers brushed hers for just a moment. They were warm. "You have my word," he said quietly. Catherine nodded. Then she turned to leave. "Miss Catherine," the Duke said. She paused at the door, looking back. "Who are you really?" he asked again. Catherine smiled. It was a small, sad smile. "Someone who used to be someone else," she said. "Does it matter?" "Yes," the Duke said. "It matters to me." But Catherine just shook her head and left the library. Because some secrets, she had learned, were safer left untold. The next morning, the Duke left Ashworth House and did not return. The Duchess was in a state of barely suppressed rage for 3 days, convinced that something had gone wrong, that the Duke had somehow outwitted her. Catherine went about her duties with her usual blank expression, and no one suspected a thing. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived for Catherine. It was from a employment agency, offering her a position as a governess to the daughters of a baronet in Devon. The salary was generous, the family respectable, the recommendation glowing. Catherine accepted immediately. She left Ashworth House on a cold January morning without saying goodbye to the Duchess. She took her one small trunk, her few belongings, and she walked out of that house and did not look back. She thought that was the end of it, that she would go to Devon, become a governess, live quietly and invisibly for the rest of her life, that the Duke of Greystone would use his letter and pass his bill and forget that a companion named Catherine had ever helped him. She was wrong. 3 months later, another letter arrived. It was brief, written in a strong, elegant hand that she recognized immediately. The bill passed. 43 children were dismissed from factory work in the first week. They tell me this is progress. I tell myself it is enough. It is not, but it is something. I thought you would want to know. Yours, Greystone. Catherine held the letter for a long time. Then she carefully folded it and put it in the drawer of her writing desk, next to the few other precious things she owned. She thought that was the end of it. It was not. The Duke wrote again 3 months after that. Just a short note, asking how she was finding Devon, whether the position suited her, whether she had everything she needed. Catherine wrote back, carefully polite, and told him she was well. The children were sweet. The family was kind. She was content. He wrote again, and again. The letters were never long, never improper, just small exchanges of news, observations, thoughts. He told her about his work in Parliament, the battles he was fighting, the small victories and large defeats. She told him about the children she taught, the books she read, the countryside around the baronet's estate. It went on for 6 months. And then one day, a different kind of letter arrived. I am coming to Devon on business next month. I wondered if you might allow me to call. There is something I wish to discuss with you. Greystone. Catherine stared at the letter. Her heart was pounding in a way that she did not entirely understand. She told herself it meant nothing, that he was simply being courteous, that there was no reason for her hands to be shaking. But she wrote back and said yes, he could call. He arrived on a bright afternoon in early autumn. The baronet and his wife were in London, and the children were with their grandmother. Catherine was alone when the Duke's carriage pulled up to the house. She had told herself she would greet him calmly, politely, with perfect composure. But when he stepped down from the carriage and looked at her, she forgot how to breathe. He looked different somehow, less guarded. There was something in his expression that she could not quite read. Something that made her feel like the ground beneath her feet, was not as solid as it had been a moment before. Miss Catherine, he said, thank you for seeing me. Your Grace, she said. Her voice was steady. That was something. They walked in the garden. It was a small garden, nothing like the grand estates he must be used to, but it was pretty in its own way. The late roses were still blooming, and the air smelled of earth and grass and approaching rain. They talked about inconsequential things at first. The weather, the journey, the countryside. But there was something underneath the conversation, something unspoken and heavy. Finally, the Duke stopped walking. He turned to face her. I did not come here to discuss the weather, he said. I know, Catherine said. I came here, he said slowly, because I have been thinking about something you said to me. In the library at Ashworth House. You asked me why I cared about the Reform Bill, why it mattered to me. Catherine nodded. No one, the Duke said, has ever asked me that before. No one in my entire life has ever looked at what I was doing and asked why I cared. They have asked what I wanted to achieve, how I planned to do it, what it would cost, but never why I cared. And when you asked me, when you stood there and demanded to know my reasons before you would help me, I realized something. What? Catherine asked quietly. That you were the first person I had spoken to in years who saw me as something other than a title, he said. The first person who treated me like I was accountable for my choices, like my reasons mattered more than my position. And I have not been able to stop thinking about it, or about you. Catherine felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Your Grace, I know what you are going to say, he interrupted gently. That I am a duke, and you are a governess, that there is an impossible distance between us, that this is madness. And you are right. It is madness. But I have spent 6 months writing you letters and waiting for your replies and telling myself that it meant nothing, and I can no longer pretend that is true. Catherine stared at him. She should have said something sensible, something to discourage him, something to protect them both from the impossible situation he was creating. But instead, she heard herself say, "What are you asking me?" The Duke took a step closer. "I am asking," he said quietly, "if you would consider allowing me to court you. Properly. With full knowledge that I intend to marry you if you will have me." The world tilted. Catherine felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "I have never been more serious about anything in my life," he said. "You are a duke," she said desperately. "I am the daughter of a man who died in disgrace. I have no fortune, no family, no position in society. If you marry me, you will be ruined." "Then I will be ruined," he said simply. "I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, playing the part of the perfect duke, using my position and power to achieve good things while maintaining absolute propriety. And I am tired, Catherine. I am so tired of pretending that it is enough, of pretending that I do not want something more, something real." He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm and steady. "You asked me once who I really was," he said. "And I think the answer is that I am someone who has been waiting his entire life to meet someone who would ask that question. Someone who would look past the title and the power and see the person underneath. Someone brave enough and clever enough and foolish enough to blackmail a duke in his own library." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes. She should not be crying. She should be thinking clearly, rationally about all the reasons this could never work. But instead, she squeezed his hand and said, "I am Miss Catherine Hartley of Hartley Manor. Or I was, before my father died and I lost everything. I was witty once, interesting, the kind of woman people wanted at their parties. And then I became invisible. I learned to disappear. And I think I had convinced myself that the person I used to be was gone forever, that she died with my father and the estate and my place in the world. She did not," the Duke said firmly. "She has been standing in corners, holding her breath, waiting for her moment. And when that moment came, she stepped forward and took it. That woman is not gone, Catherine. She is standing right here." Catherine looked at him, really looked at him. At this man who had started as a threat, become an opponent, and was now offering her something she had not even known she wanted. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "if I let you court me, if we do this impossible thing, you need to understand something. I will not be a convenient wife. I will not smile and agree and be grateful and stay quiet. I will ask you why you care. I will challenge you. I will be exactly as difficult and opinionated and inconvenient as I was before I learned to be invisible." The Duke smiled. It was the first real smile she had ever seen on his face, warm and open and entirely genuine. "Good," he said. "I would not want you any other way." And then, standing in that small garden in Devon, with the roses blooming and the rain beginning to fall, Catherine Hartley said yes. They were married 6 months later. It was not a grand society wedding. It was a small ceremony in Devon, attended by the baronet's family and a few of the Duke's closest friends. There were whispers, of course, speculation about the Duke's choice of bride, questions about who she was and where she had come from. But the Duke faced down every whisper with the same calm certainty he brought to everything he did. And Catherine, standing beside him, found that she no longer cared about the whispers. She had spent 3 years being invisible. She would not be invisible again. They returned to London as husband and wife. The Duchess of Ashworth heard the news and was said to have thrown a vase across her drawing room in rage. The Marquis of Thornbury, newly cooperative and politically useful, said nothing at all. And the ton, which had expected scandal and disaster, was forced to acknowledge that the Duke's new wife was not the fortune-hunting nobody they had anticipated. She was clever, articulate, and surprisingly difficult to dismiss. More importantly, she made the Duke happy. And a happy Duke, it turned out, was a formidable force. Catherine settled into her new life with a mixture of disbelief and determination. She had a title now, wealth, position, but more than that, she had her voice back. She could speak, she could challenge, she could be interesting again. And she used that power to support her husband's work in Parliament, to push for reforms that mattered, to turn her own experience of desperation and invisibility into a tool for helping others who had been forgotten by society. And sometimes, late at night, when the Duke was working in his study and Catherine was reading by the fire, he would look up and catch her eye and smile. And she would smile back, because they both knew the truth that no one else did. They had not fallen in love despite their circumstances. They had fallen in love because of them. Because she had been brave enough to threaten him, and he had been honest enough to tell her why. Because they had both been willing to risk everything for something they believed in. And because, in the end, they had found in each other the one thing neither of them had expected to find: someone who would ask why. Years later, Catherine would sometimes think back to that moment in the library at Ashworth House, to the way her hands had shaken as she held that letter, to the fear and the determination and the desperate hope that she was making the right choice. And she would think about all the ways that moment had changed her life, had saved her life, had given her back her life, and she would be grateful. Not just for the outcome, but for the courage it had taken to step forward, to be seen, to refuse to be invisible anymore. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the title, or the wealth, or the position, but the simple, radical act of deciding that she deserved to exist, to speak, to matter. And she had. She did. She always would. That is the story of Catherine Hartley, who was invisible until she chose not to be, who blackmailed a duke and married him, who learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is step out of the corner and demand to be seen. Now, if you enjoyed this story, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you that courage is not about never being afraid, but about acting anyway, then I need you to do something for me. I need you to subscribe to Jane Tells Stories, because I tell these stories for you, and I need to know you are listening. And if you don't subscribe, well, you owe me a favor, and I will remember. Until next time, I am Jane, and I will be here, telling stories, waiting for you to come back.